I'm Matt. Welcome back to the next installment of the first Synth series. Today I've got 4 great guests who are going to share their first Synth stories with you. They are Andrew Dugros, hopefully I've said that correctly, Synthwave Dojo, Ghostfeeder, and Haze Anderson. And you'll be seeing the videos in that order. As always, I'm going to leave a link to their channels down below. Please take a minute and stop by, check them out, and see what they're doing here on YouTube. Thanks for sticking around to watch this, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you, Matthew, to inviting me on your channel. I'm very happy. I'm Dugros. I'm a musician, a music producer, a singer, and a pianist and a keyboard player. So, thank you, and welcome to my bad English. That is my slogan on my channel. If you want to visit my channel, I'm very happy. My history, my musical history, I start to play piano at the age of 6. My father bought me my first keyboard that was a Yamaha Porta Sound, I remember. Toy keyboard, yes. And after I studied for many years piano, music theory, and music composition, my father bought me some other keyboard, for example, the Roland E20 and the Roland W30. That was the game changer, because was a music workstation, a sort of sampler, and a sequencer. So I made many music with the Roland W30, and I have also reviewed this keyboard on my channel if you are curious. After I bought the first PC, and I discovered obviously the world of the MIDI sequencing in a big screen, because I worked on the Roland W30 with a little screen, so a little screen and only numbers. When I saw for the first time the screen with the MIDI sequences, was incredible for me. And after I bought other keyboards, so for example the Korg keyboard, I remember the Korg M50, and the Nord synthesizer. Actually, I have, for example, the 2 workstation, the Yamaha Genos and the Yamaha MOX, and obviously many virtual synthesizer. I use, for example, Native Instrument, the fantastic audio modeling Swan instrument, and the Cherry audio synthesizer, for example. If you are curious, I review all these instruments on my channel. So actually I have the Roland W30 that is here in the studio, and I use it only because I have a good keyboard with aftertouch. So I use it with a MIDI control keyboard, but I don't use it really to produce the music today. But is here, is in my heart, so is here with me. Thank you, Matthew, and enjoy with this series of video that I think is very interesting, that Matthew produced for his channel. Thank you guys. Bye.
The first time I came in contact with a synth should have been the mid-80s, maybe 86 or 87. A friend of mine had one of those tiny Casio tone keyboards that you could find almost everywhere. It was a toy more than an actual instrument, but it certainly piqued my interest. I remember playing the demo piano and listening to all those awesome sounds like marimbas, FM basses, FM pianos. Super cheesy, but super fun. I'm sure I'd be delighted by it for a full 5 minutes maybe, and then go on and do something else, because no one knew how to play the piano or the keyboards. Fast forward to the early 2000s, that's when I got involved in making electronic music, got involved in production, and that's when I purchased my first MIDI controller. Being completely honest, I'm an in-the-box, virtual synth kind of guy. I've never owned a real synth, but I will someday. These days, I produce Synthwave in the box and have a huge collection of soft synths, and paired with a very nice MIDI controller like the one I recently got, which is an Arturia Keylab 61 Mark II, which has a lot of encoders and sliders. It feels to me like I have a real synth at my disposal, because I really can control almost every synth parameter I want with my fingers, with my hands, and that is super cool. To me, it makes a great difference to be able to play stuff on actual keys than entering notes in a MIDI roll editor. I know that both approaches work, but to me there's just something magical about being able to lay my fingers on keys and find happy accidents. Of course, one day I would like to own a real synth, and when I do that, I would lean towards a combination of the old and the new, something like a Roland Juno X or Jupiter X, where I have the sounds of a classic synth like the Juno and Jupiter 8, but with modern perks such as MIDI, etc., and that never goes out of tune and that kind of thing, so I can again get the best of both worlds. But until that day comes, I'll keep synthing away on my MIDI controller. Thank you so much, Matt, for having me.
Hey everyone, my name is Derek. I make music as Ghostfeeder, and I also make the occasional YouTube video where I talk about synthesizers or other music stuff that I find interesting. First of all, I want to say thank you to Matt for inviting me to be part of this first synth series. You've had some amazing guests on so far, and I am honored to have been asked to be a part of it, so thank you. So technically, the first synth that I ever owned was whatever came packed in with GarageBand around 2009, 2010. I'd always really loved electronic music, but I never knew how it was actually made. So the plugins in that program really opened the door for me and paved the way for everything else that was to follow. For the first few years of Ghostfeeder, I had no idea what I was doing with these plugins or these instruments. I would just mess around with parameters that were completely incomprehensible to me at the time until I found something I liked. Then I would usually distort it way too much and add way too many bit crushers and basically call it a day. True as it may be, I realize this is not a very sophisticated answer to this question, but I am not a very sophisticated musician. My first hardware synth, however, I purchased during the pandemic. It was a Behringer DeepMind 12 desktop module. Like every other musician at the time, I was looking at canceled tours, canceled festivals, canceled everything. So I had a lot of time on my hands, and I figured that I would actually try to learn synthesis properly. I opted for the desktop module because it was cheaper. As soon as I pushed up a fader and had that tactile experience of physically manipulating the electronic sound, I was just kind of like, oh, okay, I get it. I guess this is me now. I guess I'm a synthesizer guy now. I began playing music as a guitar player, so I've had a really good understanding of how important it is to have a relationship with the instrument, to be able to express yourself through it physically, to be able to bend a string or carry some feedback or sustain, to emote or express yourself in a really organic kind of way. And the ability to do that through a different instrument that at face value seemed so impenetrably electronic and artificial and static was a revelation for me. I liked it so much that I immediately developed a real problem and started buying all kinds of synthesizers. So if I couldn't go broke on the road, I was was going to go broke at home. I've always loved playing and creating music. I've always loved technology and gadgets, and synthesizers are really where all of those interests collide. And honestly, I felt a bit remiss for having taken so long to actually commit to understanding what synthesis was and how these instruments worked. But you know what they say. I sold the DeepMind maybe about a year ago because it kind of felt redundant, but I do still have a soft spot for it, and I suspect that the DeepMind might become a little bit of a classic years down the road. So I fully expect them to eventually sell for exorbitant prices on the internet, and I will see the ads and I'll see what people are selling them for, and I will have deep regret. Since I got into hardware, I have bought, sold, traded, and repaired a number of synthesizers, and I will probably continue to do so because even if they never end up on a finished track, synthesizers inspire me to sit down and play almost every day. And I think that finding inspiration and motivation in the tool itself is a really compelling and exciting and fun experience. The best instruments are the ones that will always continue to surprise you and reveal new things to you every time you sit down with them. It's a testament to the vintage stuff behind me that it's still relevant and you still hear these instruments on tracks from artists across every single genre at all levels of success. A couple of them are as old as I am, and it makes them feel historical. It makes them feel cultural when an instrument has a presence to it, a personality in the way it looks or feels. I find that to be motivating. And while listeners will likely never know, nor should they care, what I used to make a song, I have definitely produced tracks that wouldn't exist had the synthesizer I was using not pulled them out of me in some way. Whether you're using the stock plugins that came with the program pre-installed on your MacBook, or getting lost for hours making custom patches in a DeepMind 12, I think it's really important to remember that the most revolutionary artists and genres can almost always trace their origins back to some cheap piece of gear that was disregarded, broken, or hated, and yet in the right hands, it changed everything. So, thank you GarageBand for providing me with cheap access to tools that would honestly change the course of my life for the next decade.
Greetings, my name is Haze Anderson, and I am just another hardware jammer. And today I'm going to be reading from a script because this is really hard. I would first like to thank Matt Wright for inviting me to do this. I would also like to thank all the other participants that have shared their experiences so far, as well as those in the future to come. Thank you all very much. I was able to narrow down the candidates for my first synthesizer to only 11.
It's not even funny.
11 choices.
That's ridiculous.
And herein lies the rub. Who owned that synthesizer, and was it even ever a real synthesizer? Also, despite that I technically started hardware jamming on my channel only 6 years ago with this little device, my actual history goes back much, much further. I hardly have time to talk about the bands that have influenced me over the past 5 decades, let alone the synthesizers I encountered during that time. From the other episodes in this series, we have learned that 6 other synthesizerists started on Casio products, and I am proud to announce my membership to that club as well. My journey actually started with this synthesizer. But before I can talk about that experience, you must first know that I experienced the 1970s in its entirety, and I had limited access to pianos, organs, and even analog synthesizers, but I was much too young to understand brands and models. I simultaneously began studying music and computers in 1980 when I learned how to program on the Texas Instruments TI-994A, and I started learning music comprehension on the saxophone, which may speak for my affinity to monophonic synthesizers. My first programmed musical interlude was my favorite Christmas song, Sleigh Ride, on the Apple II Plus in 1987. I used code from this book to actually program that. And around that same time, my good friend lent me this device. This belongs to an old friend that had this back in high school. His father owned a music store and my friend played bass guitar, but he had access to many synthesizers back in those days, and this was one that his father brought home for him. My friend let me borrow this around 1986 when I was learning how to play Rush songs on drums. I also dabble with the keyboard parts in songs like Jacob's Ladder and The Tree. If you notice here it says post-code modulation. This term would haunt me for a long time. But anyway, this synth is currently powered by 5 AA batteries for a total of 7.5 volts. The DC jack is currently not working, so I plan on trying to fix that at least. I would like to do a full restore of this little guy one day, so while it is my first synth, I didn't and I still do not own it. Question, however, if I purchase this now or if I obtained it now, would this make it my first synth? Hopefully by now you know all about this keyboard. I want to point out, however, that it really doesn't sound that bad, especially when you add effects like delay and reverb. The dog. But things get really interesting when we add overdrive. Also around this time, I discovered that I was a natural drummer. I had already decided to discontinue further saxophone studies, so I quit the marching band. And I set about trying to obtain a drum set. My parents would not oblige, so I took a job at the local Taco Bell, and I just basically bought the dang thing myself. Despite naturally being able to teach myself how to play, however, my technique was abysmal and fairly unsuited for supporting any local acts. However, one good friend invited me to help him track some songs by learning how to program an Alesis HR-16, the first drum machine I encountered. While not a synthesizer, the HR-16 and its successors are romplers, and romplers fall under the broader category of synthesizers, despite not actually synthesizing the waveforms. This is not an Alesis HR-16, which was the first drum machine I learned how to program. It was 1988, and I was helping a friend who played guitar track his music to a cassette-based 4-track recorder. He borrowed the HR-16 from another friend and we both learned how to program it, producing a short EP in the process. The first SR-16 I came into contact with belonged to a bandmate in 1990. I used it to produce my first compositions along with that same person's Roland JX3P. I purchased this one in used condition sometime around 1995 to help with my timing while playing drums. The SR-16 is a very bread and butter drum machine. It has 4 outputs, 2 main and 2 auxiliary, and the sounds are pretty decent. So let's talk about the events leading up to that Roland JX3P. Before I moved to Knoxville, I played in a cover band, and our keyboard player had a Korg M1. I thought he would be impressed by Rick Wakeman, so I played him the first track from Anderson, Brookford, Wakeman, and Howe. And he flat out told me I was weird. And for the record, I'm also a fan of the Dead Milkmen, and yeah, somebody's going to get that. But anyways, I digress. I told you way too many bands for this video. So I moved to Knoxville for college, and I discovered that one of my roommates played guitar. Time passes, and we find a bass player and a singer, and we form a band. My roommate mentions he has a keyboard back home, and he decides to go retrieve it. This is not a JX3P, which was the first analog synth I got to know. That JX3P belonged to a roommate in college, and later we formed a band, albeit none of us in that band played keys. However, I did spend a lot of time with that synthesizer, although I really was not very impressed by it. At the time, I still had no concept of analog versus digital, and I pretty much believed all synthesizers were just some kind of computer. I was so far abstracted from the simple concepts of generating waveforms and altering them with filters. I was able, however, to sequence my first jam on this JX3P, which oddly enough was in the time signature of 13/8. Of interest, when I bought this particular JX03 Boutique back in 2018, I had no idea it was a recreation of the first analog synth I got to really know. So I went ahead and I sequenced that original jam that I came up with back in 1990, 1991 or something. Close enough. In 1995, I obtained a degree in audio engineering with an emphasis in electronic music. I left Knoxville and came back to Murfreesboro and enrolled in what was then known as the RIM program. 75% of my peer students were budding musicians as well, and the music scene in that city during the 1990s was utterly explosive. My drumming ability increased tenfold, and at the facilities I had access to a lot of incredible gear, including giant 48-track analog and digital studio mixers, cabinets full of dynamic compressor and even ribbon mics, 2-inch 24-track analog tape recorders, which we time-coded by striping a track with SMPTE, and we edited with razor blades. And of course, the MIDI lab. I studied analog recording and mixing, electronic music production, 3D animation, and even film composition, as well as Foley work. This is where I learned my first DAW before they were even called that, and where I got to intimately know the Roland D70 synthesizer. This is not a D70, and it's not even a close proximity. This is a D50 clone, and I purchased it to cover my nostalgia for the D70, which I learned inside and out in 1993 and 94. That was for several college courses that I took on electronic music production, and the Roland D70 manual was one of our textbooks for the first class. Here we used Mark of the Unicorn Performer, before it was called Digital Performer, on Macintoshes to sequence the D70, 3 EMU Proteus sound modules, and an Akai S1000 sampler, and we could record the audio to DAT. I produced about 20 tracks during this time and cut my teeth on hardware jamming. The total cost of the gear I used was close to $10,000 back in the mid-1990s. One of the reasons I wanted to purchase the D05 was because I really loved the drum sets in the D70. Unfortunately, I found out the hard way that this doesn't quite have the same thing. The drum sets are split, so you basically only get up to 2 sounds, whereas on the D70 you could have a full drum kit across all the keys. It still makes for some fun jamming though. The late 1990s saw a radical turn in my interest as I decided to pivot from musician to, well, programmer. And by 1999 I would obtain another degree, this time in computer science. That's a whole other story, but the skinny is that I was just not a fan of virtual music production. So I figured if computers were going to take over everything, I might as well switch back to programming. Musically speaking, however, during this time I put a lot of effort into integrating electronic drums with acoustic drums. I used a Roland KC500 keyboard amplifier on stage to project the new sounds, including samples and a TR-808 kick drum. The irony is that I wouldn't have even known what a TR-808 was if someone threw one at me on stage. This was still an age when digital was king, and I would surely have sold my analogs if I had become a keyboard player instead. Against the grain, my bass player at the time purchased a Moog Theremin, and many key players in our circle played old beat-up Rhodes. The 70s, 80s, and 90s now represent nostalgia for our creative foundations. If you are trying to visualize these eras, just remember that there are always exceptions to the rule. In 1995, I purchased a full Roland TD7 electronic drum kit. I eventually sold that full kit around 2006 when I was living in New York City to a friend, and I do not regret it. I used that TD7 kit for many shows with the different bands that I played for. Despite not regretting that sale, I did want another TD7 Brain, and while I was able to get this one for very cheap, it currently suffers from a broken encoder knob, blocking access to many necessary features, despite the still functioning navigation buttons. I hope to fix this soon, however. So to demonstrate, I'm going to use my Electro-Harmonix Clockworks, which basically has 4 different clocks that can be used to trigger 4 different instruments within this module. To change drum kits, the Roland MS Sampler was fairly special in its day, being so portable and still having a decent amount of memory to work with. However, its interface is much too antiquated for serious use today. I mean, come on, RCA jacks? Really? But I still keep it around because I just don't sell gear. So far, I've only sold the TD7 electronic drum set. Back in the day, I used this with the TD7 to trigger various samples on the MS1 by hitting the drum pads. 2 of my favorite samples were Aquatic Ambience from the video game Donkey Kong Country, and the Jeopardy theme, which I used while I waited for the rest of my bandmates to set up their gear. For this demonstration, I want to point out how the MS1 integrates so well with the TD7 via MIDI. What's going to happen is I'm going to use the Clockworks to trigger the TD7, but it in turn is going to send MIDI to the MS1, which will trigger some samples. Silly, huh? And now roughly 18 years passes, as my career takes me to New York City and Los Angeles and back. Of interest during this time, a bandmate introduces me to Zombie, a band influenced by Goblin. I saw the best Primus show ever of all time. I saw Meshuggah at the... Whoa, I'm sorry. Not supposed to talk about bands, no time. What I should mention, however, are two things. Number one, I discovered Goa Psytrance around 2008, and I have deeply desired to produce such music ever since. Number two, I started my channel as a drummer in 2013, but I had no problem changing to a DAWless hardware jammer when the fate of my destiny was about to change on that fateful day in 2017. In the fall of 2017, YouTube recommended a gear review/demo to me. It was Gaz Williams demoing the PO20 rhythm for Sonic State, and I was instantly sold. This is not the PO20 rhythm. This is a PO28 robot. To this day, however, I am still shocked that all drummers never really took to the PO12 like I did. But I immediately saw the value as a metronome that it could offer for me. I also had no idea, however, that the PO12 rhythm would become a future classic. A few days later, I decided to visit a local guitar center, but all they had for sale was a PO20 robot. I would not purchase a PO12 rhythm for several more weeks. What can I say? I absolutely love the robot. I use it as much as I can. I try to use it as a lead guitar in a sense. One thing I love about this thing is how you can change the octave so easily by just pressing the sound button. By this time, my desire to rekindle interest in hardware jamming had already peaked. I can do this for what used to cost $10K and now for less than $1,000. I went back to Guitar Center a few days later and purchased these. I immediately saw the value in the Volca Kick as a dedicated 4 on the floor for techno music, and it technically is an analog synth. The Volca FM can load virtually any existing Yamaha DX7 patch, and it is a true synthesizer. I literally started my new journey into hardware jamming with these toys, but I quickly began expanding and adding to my studio, and it was not long before I had most of the pocket operators, Korg Volcas, and Roland Boutiques. I have probably suffered more ear damage from the Volca Kick than all my years of playing drums, and the reason why is because I learned the hard way what a resonant filter does using the headphone jack in headphones. Beware, this shoots sonic bullets. As I said before, the Korg Volca FM can load virtually any Yamaha DX7 patch, and I have loaded these with the bunch that I have curated that I found online. I kind of like this harpsichord patch. It has a number of neat sound effects. Even the Vangelis patch. But perhaps my favorite patch of all are these drums that can be used with an arpeggiator. Now, I have to talk about the Volca keys, because this was my first true experience with an analog synthesizer. I love the Volca FM so much I decided to see what the keys was all about, so I rushed to Corner Music in Nashville and purchased one. I immediately got back to my vehicle and cranked it up, but could not produce any sounds. I even tried to load the presets, but nothing seemed to work. That's a preset, right? No sound. Well, I quickly took it back inside to see if it was broken, and that's when I learned that not only does it not have presets, but the filter was completely cutting out all frequencies from the oscillator. What a humbling experience I had, and it reminded me that despite my experience level, I still had much to learn. That's why it's paraphonic. Gateway drugs indeed. And now the question is, which is the real first synthesizer? The only true analog synth I first used was the JX3P, but it was not mine. None of the gear in the MIDI lab was mine, and for the record it was all digital. Analog was very dead in the 1990s. The SR16 and TD7 are Rompler-based drum machines. I own them, but they don't do true synthesis. The PO28 is a Rompler-based groove box with limited sequencing. In many ways, the Volca Kick is a true analog synth, but it is among the most limited of the limited. The Volca FM is a true 6-operator FM algorithm-based synthesizer. Despite its limited polyphony, it can load virtually any Yamaha DX7 patch. That's powerful. And finally, the Volca keys, while also very limited, is a paraphonic analog. But no, I am going with this VC340 as my first synthesizer. It merely features paraphonic divide-down synthesis, but it is true analog and it has a real key bed. I purchased this synthesizer from Pure Ambient Drone 4 years ago, and I really would love to hear his story on a future installment of this series. This concludes the story of my first synthesizer. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it, and please support all of the independent content creators out there that you can. Thank you very much.